afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Sur Schaefer. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Director of Strategy and Translation for the Translational Biology and Engineering program. I'd like to also introduce my partner in this venture, Ann Samart, who's the Director of Strategy and Translation for the Transform Heart Failure Initiative. On behalf of both programs, the Ted Rogers Center for Heart Research and the University of Toronto, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our inaugural Echo Discovery Pitch Competition. So this is really a great opportunity for us to celebrate the graduation of our 2023 Echo Discovery cohort, and we really appreciate you taking time off your busy schedules to join us. We have a really exciting program scheduled for today, and we're going to get started on. So first, I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So as I mentioned, we have an exciting program planned for this afternoon. And I'm just going to very briefly give you an overview of what to expect over the next couple of hours. So following these introductory remarks, we're going to start the pitch competition, and you'll be hearing from 4 teams from our 2023 Echo Discovery program. And following the pitch presentations, we have a special fireside chat with Dr. Jacqueline Shreibati, the Senior Clinical Lead at Google. And this will be around 5 p.m. And while we are enjoying the fireside chat, our judging panel will be hard at work, deliberating and deciding on the winning team, whom they'll be announced just before 6 p.m., the closing of the event. So just a few housekeeping notes. As I mentioned, today's pitch presentations will be recorded for training purposes, and we'll also be recording the fireside chat. Live captioning is enabled. That being said, you can disable the live caption display on your screen at any time. I've taken the liberty of putting everybody on mute throughout the session, with the exception of the judges and the teams. No questions will be taken from the audience during the pitch competition. However, during the fireside chat, if you have any question for our speaker, please feel free to enter your question into the chat box, and we'll try our best to have your questions addressed. So it's almost time to start the pitch competition, but before we hear from our 4 teams of aspiring entrepreneurs, I just want to give you a brief background on how we got here today. So last October, through a partnership between TBEP and the Transform HF initiative, we nationally launched Echo Discovery, and this is a 6-month foundational education program, and we designed it with the intention of making available to those who are interested in cardiovascular health ideation, in research translation. They're considering entrepreneurship but aren't quite sure how to get started. And so we launched the program in last October. We launched our first call, and we were able to recruit a diverse group of 30 trainees, from undergraduate to graduate students, clinical and postdoctoral fellows, as well as clinicians. And we recruited trainees from across Canada. And over these past 6 months, they've been part of the program and participating in the elements of the program, and which included ideation workshops, fireside chats, as well as an immerse and shadowing program for select trainees. And so through the Echo Discovery program and its education elements, our trainees have been able to work together, and they've been forming teams and leveraging the ideation techniques that they have learned throughout the program. They've been brainstorming together and conceiving exciting ideas and innovative solutions within the cardiovascular health space. And 4 of these teams have been selected and are here today to present their novel ideas for a chance to win $500. And so to help us with this, we are very fortunate to have an exceptional panel of judges with us today who'll be helping us decide on the winning team. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Craig Simmons, who's a distinguished professor of mechanobiology at the University of Toronto. He's also the scientific director of TBEP, as well as the co-lead of the Transform Heart Failure Initiative, so both mine and Ann's boss. Our next judge is Dr. Darshan Brahmbhatt, who's a cardiologist and a heart failure fellow at Mount Sinai and Toronto General Hospitals. I'm delighted to introduce our next judge, Julie Vizza, who is a patient partner and a steering committee member at the Transform Heart Failure Initiative, and she's also a PhD trainee in health science at Ontario Tech University. Last but not least, we have Dr. Sumaiyah Rehman, who's the co-founder of DTPX Therapeutics, and is the startup out of UHN. She's also a scientific associate at Princess Margaret Cancer Center at UHN. So we're sincerely grateful for your time today, and we really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. So without further delay, it's an absolute pleasure for me to introduce our extraordinary ECHO Discovery pitching teams for this year, who are Cardiofy, Panorama Health, Pressure Pal, and Soul Savers. I'd like to congratulate them all for their hard work and for making it this far. So just as a quick note for today's competition, each of our teams will have 5 minutes to pitch their innovative idea, and they'll have 5 minutes of Q&A with our expert judging panel. And as I mentioned earlier, after the pitch presentations, the judges will deliberate and we will decide and announce the winning team before the closing of the event. Okay, so we're going to get started, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our first team, Cardiofy, which includes Rayan Basawan, Jonathan Wu, and Mohammed Anwar. So I'm just going to stop sharing and let them take the stage.
I'm sorry, you said Cardiofy?
Yes.
I
apologize. I'm sorry. Yeah, Soul Savers. Go ahead, Soul Savers. You can go first.
Hello, everyone. The battle against diabetic foot ulcers, time is of the essence. Can you, are you seeing my screen?
No, we're not seeing your screen.
Just give me a second. I thought we were the last, so it's just a bit of confusion.
No worries, take your time.
Okay. Hello, everyone. In the battle against diabetic foot ulcers, time is of the essence. Every moment counts when it comes to preventing amputations in patients with diabetes. That's why we are proud to introduce Podia Scale, the ultimate solution for the early detection of diabetic foot ulcers. Diabetic foot ulcers pose a significant risk for patients with diabetes, potentially resulting in severe complications and leg amputations. Diabetes impedes wound healing, underscoring the crucial need for prevention and early diagnosis. Regular self-assessment of feet is essential for diabetic patients to identify early signs of ulcer. Additionally, timely visits to primary care physician or podiatrist for foot assessment are strongly advised. Delayed assessments may lead to advanced stages of ulcers, necessitating extensive wound care or urgent amputations. Our Podia Scale could be a game changer that would empower patients and healthcare professionals to take control. By catching ulcers in their early stages, we can save limbs and transform lives. Since Podia Scale does the assessment, patients can assess their feet frequently at their convenience. By placing Podia Scale in local pharmacies, the rural diabetic population can skip frequent visits to podiatrists or primary care physicians solely for the purpose of foot assessment. With Podia Scales, we can enable early detection and intervention, significantly reducing the risk of wound progression. So how does Podia Scale work? It uses a multi-feature checklist to perform a comprehensive assessment of the foot, almost like a physician or podiatrist. Podia Scale will be able to detect any structural deformity or skin breakage, changes in color and temperature to identify the initiation or progression of a foot ulcer. In terms of our target market, Podia Scale can cater to individuals with diabetes who live alone and struggle to assess their own feet. For families, it can alleviate worries about their loved ones developing diabetic foot issues. Caregivers can appreciate regular foot assessment that would prevent advanced ulcers. Payers will be pleased if hospitalizations and amputations are reduced, lowering healthcare costs. As per the market size, the global diabetic foot ulcers market was valued at $1.4 billion in 2022, as is projected to reach $3.48 billion by 2030, growing at a compound annual growth rate of 9.24%. Annually, a device such as the Podia Scale could save over $43 billion for the US healthcare system alone and prevent 100,000 lower limb amputations. We do have competitors. To our knowledge, there are two similar products, Podium and SmartMap, in their approval stages in Europe and US. However, both these devices only focus on temperature assessment as a predictor of foot ulcers. We're expecting that the final approved Podia scale could be sold to pharmacies across North America, who can in turn recover the cost of the device by charging per assessment. Pharmacies could also have these devices at the store as value-added services for their customers, almost like weighing scales and blood pressure measuring stations currently existing in some pharmacies. We could also generate revenue by charging a minimal subscription fee for transmitting weekly or monthly reports to healthcare providers. If we are able to secure funding, we hope to develop a prototype by 2024, conduct small-scale testing in 2025, conduct clinical trials by 2027, and generate revenues for our investors by 2030. Our team currently comprises of Jonathan, who is a biomedical engineer with extensive experience in building healthcare products. Ray is a vascular surgery resident and has experience dealing with diabetic patients hospitalized for amputations. I am a family physician with experience in healthcare research and building machine learning models for early warning sign detection. We ran our ideas with experts and users in this field and got great positive responses. Here are some of the testimonials that we got on our hypothetical product. On this note, I conclude my pitch. Thank you all for listening patiently. We hope that you will join in our journey to revolutionizing diabetic foot assessment. The floor is now open for questions.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for that excellent talk. And the floor is now open for questions from the judges. Maybe we'll start with Craig. Please go ahead, Craig. Okay, hang on a second. Please go ahead.
Okay, there. Yeah, I wasn't able to unmute. Thank you, Mohammed. That was a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Could you tell me a little bit behind the technology itself? You kind of implied that you get imaging and temperature, and it seemed like there'd be some sort of I don't know, AI background that would recognize what's an ulcer versus something else. Can you tell me a little bit about the technology?
Sure. Yeah, I can. So it's mostly still in a theoretical phase. We're planning a device, just the weighing scale, where you can put the foot in, and this the shades that you can see in the image, they are mostly like the sensor cameras there, which takes images of the foot. So the base idea basically is around the parameters, like the structural deformity, changes in skin texture, breakage, redness and swelling. All this can be done with image analysis with computer vision. We're looking at the image of the foot itself. In terms of the increased temperature, we're assuming that on the floor, if you can see, there are some sensors to assess the temperature of the foot. We can also do this with the images, like the infrared images of the sole, by looking at the temperature differences. And also, definitely, we need to have create a data set where which will help us build the model itself, ML model, who can differentiate between foot that has ulcer, that doesn't have ulcer. Those things need to be done in. But the overall idea is the image analysis with computer vision can help us get all these parameters that we're looking for.
So that was my part of my question was, so how much data do you need, or how many feet do you need in order to establish that model? Or is this something where, is that what it's based on versus changes over time within an individual patient?
We still are thinking around this area. I'm not exactly sure how many, but it's going to be at least every individual. Like, what if we have a sample of like 1,000 patients, and every patient gives us images for at least 5 or 6 encounters over the course of 6 months, we can feed that into our model. That's the initial plan.
Yeah, thank you
for getting data. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Julie, do you have any questions?
Sure, great presentation. So I'm just wondering, have you and your team considered how patient engagement might play a role in the development of this unit, I guess we'll call it?
Yeah, sure, definitely. So if you look back in one of our slides, so once we come up with the prototype, definitely while building the prototype, we're definitely going to ask, survey our patients what sort of, like the image that the structure that we have now, it's just basically brainstorming and coming up to this, but definitely how that device is going to look like. We're going to take feedback from them around that, what they're comfortable with, especially in terms of the food that we are saying, that could be a concern for some of the patients, that they're not comfortable putting the food inside, something of those sort. So we're going to take those feedbacks from the patients, and then once this prototype is developed, for like in 2025, we are saying we're going to do some small scale testing that definitely involves how comfortable they are with these devices. Do they want any changes or not? We are going to incorporate their feedback into it before going into before having the final product. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Darshan.
Thank you again for a great presentation. My question was about your market. Can you just describe to me who and what you think you're going to be able to get this device to do, and will people find it acceptable?
So that's a great question. So in terms of again saying these are all theoretically we have come up with this, and based on some of the discussions with some of the experts in this field, then our market, we definitely were thinking of patients who were at high risk of foot ulcers. They could have it as in their home, but then again we pivoted it and thinking that maybe the device is expensive, maybe the bigger market could be the pharmacies keeping it at their location. Like for example, if you say the device costs around $500 US, they have this device at the stations. It could be a value-added service for the customers that are coming in, or they could charge per assessment. These things we need to figure out in the long run, what's more feasible, but definitely the market is the patients, or the family members of the patients who are not comfortable assessing themselves, or they think that they might not do a good job, or have this at their home or at the local pharmacies, so that instead of visiting podiatrists or primary care physicians on regular intervals, though I'm not saying that it's going to replace that meetings, it's just going to reduce the number of visits just for the purpose of foot assessment. So currently what I know from the US market is that every visit costs an additional $25 just to get the foot assessed. That's so if we can at least instead of 10 or 15 or 20 assessments, reduce it to 5, we can save some amount of healthcare costs in that area. That's the generic idea. Their patients definitely will have to visit the doctors to get their prescriptions refilled. There's no doubt about that. They'll get their assessment done for other things, but the sole idea is it's good if the assessment is done by the patient themselves at their convenience.
Thank you.
And does it answer? I hope it answers. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. And Sumaiyah.
Hi, Mohammed. That was a great presentation. Thank you for that. My question kind of is a little two-part. One is around your competitive landscape. I want to understand your competitors, and with that in mind, and you may have touched on it and I may have missed it a bit, but with your competitors in mind, I'm curious to know where exactly your IP lies and what's your IP strategy with that regard. If you could elaborate on that.
Sure. So both the products that are, so the diabetic foot, there are lots of products on that. There's wound dressing, there's lots of variations in terms of product. These two are very near to us. That's why we presented them, the Podium and SmartMark. Both of them only assesses temperature. That's our concern. But for a foot to be assessed for ulcer, there are at least 4 to 5 parameters that needs to be looked into. For example, there's skin breakage, skin conditions, there is structural deformities, there's redness and swelling, there is pain sensation, which I'm not touching on now because we are currently focusing on 3 parameters rather than one that are like there or all 6 of them. So that's our that's different from others, is that we have 2 extra parameters here, which might give a better prediction model.
And just to follow up on that, and your IP would then specifically lie in the development of that technology, or is that technology that already exists that you would incorporate into your product?
So the image analysis, computer visions, like the technology is out there. It's just about using it in this context. It's not yet done. People are, so even our competitors, they are using computer visions, but that's specifically only looking at temperature. But the computer vision is being used in other areas, not in this, probably not in this particular area, at least not to my knowledge. So that's something of an innovation there, or maybe I would say just a trial runs needs to be done. How this is going. Theoretically, we thought this is possible. We're currently in that stage, to be honest. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mohammed and the Cardiofy team. Sorry, the Soul Savers team. Finally, we are going to hear from Cardiofy, which obviously we were supposed to go first. So I apologize for that. So our next team, Cardiofy, they have, again, they're part of our ECHO cohort. They are Anat Usatinsky, John Darwin Namata, Dina Sochnavar, and Samantha Unger, Vaswani Kumar Luka. Please feel free to share your screen and begin whenever you're ready.
So Cardiofy embarked on a journey to understand the challenges faced by those impacted by heart failure by directly engaging with them. And the insights we gathered were truly eye-opening. Our conversations with patients revealed their demoralization when it comes to shopping for an optimal diet. Exercise too proved to be a daunting task as they asked themselves, how hard can I push myself and still be okay? The overall diagnosis itself is terrifying as well, and many patients found themselves working through the stages of grief. Clearly, there is a pressing need for more comprehensive support for heart failure patients. This led us to the crucial question, how can we provide effective support to heart failure patients in their physical exercises, mental health, and dietary changes for optimal cardiac rehabilitation? This led us, so enter cardiac rehabilitation, a well-established program encompassing patient assessment, exercise counseling, education, and stress reduction. Although seemingly straightforward, this program has proven to be powerful, with the potential to lower the risk of death by 47% and heart attack by 31% when properly followed. Surprisingly, most Canadians are not prescribed cardiac rehab or fail to complete their programs. This can be attributed to patients being left with limited guidance, fear, or inadequate resources. To address these limitations and stay true to the pillars of cardiac rehabilitation, our dedicated team has created CardioLoop, a patient-focused system that revolutionizes the approach to cardiac rehabilitation by closing the loop between patients and practitioners. CardioLoop is a remote platform designed to administer, track, and modify cardiac rehabilitation. Think of it as a closed-loop system, akin to a thermostat sensing the room's temperature and adjusting your furnace or air conditioning accordingly. Through CardioLoop, patients can effortlessly input information about their diet and mental health, along with their heart rate and respiratory rate data from wearables they may already own. But here's where it gets even more remarkable. Our system collects sweat during exercise and analyzes and metabolites and microRNA to gain deeper insights into the impact of lifestyle changes on the patient's well-being. By motivating users to exercise through its intentional engineering of sample collection and providing insightful measurements, CardioLoop becomes an integral part of the cardiac rehab journey. Now let's talk about the market opportunity. In Canada alone, there are approximately 750,000 individuals living with heart failure, with around 100,000 newly diagnosed each year. Shockingly, a staggering 75% of these patients are not completing cardiac rehab, despite its impressive benefits due to the previous mentioned reasons. However, a Canadian study has shown that patients who complete cardiac rehab within the first 3 years can reduce healthcare utilization costs by at least $8 per day or $3,000 per year, compared to those without cardiac rehab. So recognizing the immense potential for healthcare savings, we estimate the total addressable market opportunity to be $300 million per year. Our initial goal is to target the 40% of individuals who are newly diagnosed and discharged from acute care each year. Furthermore, we aim to bridge the gaps in cardiac rehab use, particularly among those living in remote areas and women. In the vast market, none of our competitors offer similar devices. While there have been developments in sweat-based systems, they have primarily focused on different medical conditions and components of sweat. Other cardiac health assessment devices either lack integration with clinical settings or are designed specifically for certain groups. Existing wellness apps, on the other hand, provide scattered information that is difficult for patients to navigate and often requires manual data entry. Additionally, these apps predominantly target mental health or are part of the jurisdiction-specific systems. As we progress, we have strategically divided our next milestones into 3 key areas: business development, technical development, and system integration. We need to better understand the market and the willingness to pay across patients and insurance providers, while also developing partnerships needed for success. The biomarker system needs to be prototyped and validated. Finally, the systems described need to be integrated and assessed in user studies. Thank you. We are Cardify and we're ready to listen to your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, for the presentation. And the floor is open for questions. Maybe we'll start with Sumaiyah this time.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. That was lovely. I guess I'm curious to know if you could expand on your revenue model a little bit. Maybe I missed it, but.
So we have a couple of different ones that we've thought about, and that belongs a bit to our next steps. But the first one we've thought a bit about is whether or not, given that healthcare systems are the ones currently bearing the cost of the lack of cardiac rehab being provided, working with healthcare systems to try to work that way as a revenue model, because the healthcare utilization costs fall on them ultimately at the moment in a public healthcare system. The other thing we thought about, and this we need to flesh out a little better, is what the willingness of patients to pay would be. In our post that we did online, we heard people complaining about the costs, but that was also in a lot of some responses from the US, where the healthcare system is structured differently. So that's definitely a gap that we need to look into filling. I'm not sure if anyone wants to add.
Yeah, and in addition to what Samantha was saying, we were exploring options of doing some sort of partnerships with some of the existing software and devices that exist out there. For example, part of cardiac rehabilitation is mental health support, and there are some really great mental health support systems out there, and it would be really nice if we can integrate those, and that could look like some sort of referral system. But definitely we need to look more into what the patients and the end users would want and need to better support them and model our market that way.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Darshan, do you have any questions?
Yeah, just a brief question. Could you just give me a bit more information about what biomarkers you think may be useful to be collecting before you can then validate them?
I can take this one for a little bit. So we've looked at a lot of different ones that can come from sweat, because there have been a lot of research articles that have been published recently about the biomarkers in sweat that are closely correlated to heart functionality. So for example, there's sodium, there's ascorbic acid, and mu peptide Y. And for example, sodium is important when you're trying to keep like intracellular activities functional, and then abnormal sodium levels can tell you whether you have unstable intracardiac metabolisms. And so we're hoping to use biomarkers like that to be able to better understand how the patient's heart is, and then be able to give them close looped feedback to help them make decisions in their life.
There's been cool research also in using like microRNA and vesicles that you can find in sweat that could help you monitor long-term endurance training progress, which would be relevant. But it's a wide field, like Tina mentioned.
Okay, great, thank you. Julie, do you have any questions?
Sure. So I'm just curious, and some of this might overlap with some of the answers you've already provided, but if your team has had any considerations surrounding some of the barriers to engagement or having your patients participate in some of this. So like, for instance, accessibility.
Yeah, we definitely took that into account. We are still looking at this as a platform system. We don't have any necessarily, we don't know exactly what platform this will be, and it provides us a lot of flexibility. And in addition to that, this idea came to life because of accessibility. A lot of the systems that currently track cardiovascular rehabilitation might require a lot of equipment, for example, cameras that would track the motion, and that might be a little inaccessible for individuals that don't want to exercise at home necessarily, or don't have the proper lighting or the space for it. So our system can be implemented anywhere. It could be implemented in any geographical location and on anyone. And in addition to that, we are also still talking to patients still. We've had some really interesting conversations and follow-ups with individuals. So we're continuing to learn about the barriers that are there for the patients that experience heart failure.
We're still kind of
Thank you.
fleshing out. Oh, sorry.
Or no, go ahead.
Oh, fleshing out what we mean by platform, even, and whether like an app makes sense, or even like a texting based system so you can reach areas that maybe don't have internet connection as strongly. But that's kind of where we're at.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Craig, do you have any questions?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I loved how you used Reddit to engage with a large patient population. That's fantastic. I'm a little uncertain about what is the product? Is it just the sweat sensor? Is there something bigger than that? And how does it address, you identify that, you know, a very small fraction of heart failure patients actually get cardiac rehab. How does your solution address that? I'm missing that.
Yeah, I could try answering that question. If we could go back to the slide where we describe what cardiac rehabilitation is, maybe that will help frame what we're proposing. Essentially, there's different definitions for this. So we found that these categories are the four most common categories when describing cardiac rehabilitation. So our system is a system that integrates all of these aspects into one system that users can use to access patient assessment, education for heart and healthy living, counseling to reduce stress, and exercise counseling and training. So part of our product is the sweat patch. But in addition to that, it's the platform as a whole that would allow patients to have more certainty in what they're doing in their cardiac rehabilitation, and a way to track their cardiac rehabilitation is according to plan. And like our name suggests, like we're kind of hoping to close the loop between patients and clinicians. So we're hoping that the information that is collected via our system will not only help motivate and keep a user on track, but also be able to help the clinician assess the progress the patient is performing and adapt it that way. So it's a system in a whole, and it's also the algorithm with which we will use to give feedback to the individual.
Is the lack of use of cardiac rehab, is that because it's not prescribed by the physician, or is it just that there's lack of adherence by the patient? And does that then, whichever of those it is, does that determine who your customer is? Like, is your customer the physician, or is your customer the patient?
So the unfortunate, the unfortunate answer is that it's both. The unfortunate thing that it's both not prescribed enough and then not followed enough. The barriers to prescription are things like it's not seen like a medication, so it's a lot easier to incentivize prescribing medications. but also not even at the time of some of the studies we read, not all provinces and territories had cardiac rehab programs available. So there's both like a lack of availability, and there physically aren't enough spots in Canadian programs to support the need that currently exists. But in addition, it's not being prescribed as often as it should be. So there's it's kind of unfortunately a multi-problem situation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Cardiofy. We're going to move to our next speakers, which is Panorama Health. And from that team, we have Tenzin Yangzom and Nathan Holwell, Ruilin Wu, Kathryn Howe, Sophie Sigfstead. Please feel free to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Thank you, everybody, very much for this opportunity. So just want to spend a minute and elaborate on this statement because I'm the one that made it. So I'm a vascular surgeon, and I really wouldn't have a job if it wasn't for smoking. Every time I run a clinic, I have a patient and potentially a family member joining.
Sorry, Kathryn, we're not seeing the slides properly.
Great. Awesomeness. Can you see them now?
We can, you just need to hit present properly.
Are you seeing these?
I think you shared the slide set rather than the presentation.
Tell you what, I'll just go to the backup, which was the PowerPoint, which is perhaps more effective anyway. So just a second. I'm sorry, guys.
I just need to pick the right screen.
Are you seeing this?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, sorry, guys. Slightly better on the other system, but the PowerPoint will have to do. So thank you very much for the opportunity. We do appreciate it. And thanks for your patience with that. So I just want to spend a minute and on this slide and really elaborate on what I meant by this statement that I made. Really, there is not a clinic that doesn't go by where I don't get frustrated by the fact that we don't have a way to help people quit smoking. And so when people come to my clinic as a vascular surgeon, almost always they've had a consequence from a lifetime of smoking. That can include a stroke, and therefore the morbidity associated with that. It can be one or maybe both legs that have been amputated for same reason, blockages causing lack of blood flow to the legs and ultimately major amputation. Some people have died as a result of an abdominal aortic aneurysm that's ruptured. And all of these are all related directly to smoking. What I've described is really within the bed of cardiovascular disease, and it does account for an estimated almost 18 million deaths worldwide. We know that tobacco use and smoking is the single largest avoidable health risk for cardiovascular diseases. But we have a new monster in the room, which includes vaping and e-cigarette use. It's on the rise with many teens, young adults, and never lifetime smokers that have started to take this up. And in fact, it was declared an epidemic by the US in 2019. We are starting to see emerging reports about the profound effects of this on the cardiovascular system, including an increased risk of heart attack. Both tobacco smoking and vaping or e-cigarettes actually cause an immediate increase in heart rate, which I'll come back to in a minute. Most patients or people who smoke actually want to quit. And this is true for adult smokers, where at least 2/3 of them want to quit, and the same for the youth that have taken it up. We also know that within standardized care approaches, such as personalized interactions, these are effective for smoking habit change. And that can include something like initiating an appointment to go visit your family physician, setting a stop date, and then taking a medication or using an adjunctive measure to try to quit smoking. Or even better, if you can, to try to get into a smoking cessation clinic where you have addiction specialists that really help walk people through a smoking quitting program. The thing is, these are time retentive and they are human resource intensive, and there's a huge barrier to access. And so we're proposing a solution. We are really at this point developing a conversational AI app that is triggered by heart rate elevation after smoking, which then engages users to initiate positive behavioral change. So let me walk you through that. The first step is really detection with an immediate and pronounced increase in heart rate that's picked up from the fitness tracker. And secondly, an engagement component, which is that there's an automatic interactive AI chatbot conversation that's initiated that uses and takes advantage of known cognitive behavioral therapy approaches to try to reduce smoking behavior. And the workflow would really look like this: taking an individual who might be a heavy smoker, wearing some form of fitness tracker. Here we've depicted it as a watch, but it could be something else, and has a smartphone. When the heart rate is elevated in response to smoking, there's an initiation of our app with that chatbot that goes through a positive interaction and tries to initiate behavior change. And over time, this hopefully then would lead to reduction in smoking and ultimately cessation. But we appreciate and acknowledge that this is actually a lifetime journey. And what we're really talking about is almost having an app that becomes a friend for life and a support system for life, that then as they go through potential relapse, they actually have a chance to continue to go through this journey of positive behavioral change, with then success stories showing that you've got a depiction here, like you see, of a flourishing tree. Within the competitive landscape, there are definite standard of care elements that I've already alluded to, and there are even traditional self-reporting smoking cessation apps. But with Panorama Health, we actually tick the box on several fronts. It has a low financial and human resource cost. There are no side effects because no medications are being taken. There are personalized interactions, albeit virtual, and there is an easy and timely access as a result of this being something that's automated by the AI chatbot, and all it requires is a fitness tracker. And ultimately, the combination of these leads to long-term engagement, which really is the solution you need to have in your back pocket for smoking cessation. When we talk about who we're helping the individual when it comes to the risk of cardiovascular complications, like the patients I've described in my clinic. We have a family level where we're talking about reducing caregiver burnout, because you can imagine the deathly effect of families trying to care for a loved one that has lost one or maybe both legs or has succumbed to a major stroke. At a system level, this has the potential to save Canadian healthcare system billions of dollars. And at a global level, of course, this can translate to a more sustainable and healthy population. From a market perspective, if you look globally at the number of individuals that want to quit smoking, at 2/3, we have about 8 million people that want to quit. That's our total addressable market. Within the serviceable available market, we have a global smoking population who want to quit and own a fitness tracker, and this turns into almost 160 million people. Of the obtainable market within that, this would be about capturing 1% of the global market. This represents 1.58 million people. And if we really honed in on the North American market, we could talk about going after 5%, which is very reasonable within the first 3 to 5 years. Our commercialization strategy at this point really is direct to consumer, ultimately with the goal being that this should be a reimbursable product. And along the way, we are already envisioning how do we make this about health equity and health justice, where we ensure that certain funds are set aside to help the low and middle income resource people that really do need some assistance. Within our milestones, there really does need to be acquisition of funding throughout, but importantly, we use that to then hire to fill our knowledge gaps, to initiate research collaborations that then help us with the completion of app design and development. And importantly, as I've talked about, to really talk about a reimbursement strategy where we approach insurance companies and government programs to try to make sure that we get this in motion. And ultimately, we would be talking about at least a market entry just after 2026. Our team includes several people, myself, but Tenzin, Sophie, Ruilin, and Nathan, all of them have a diverse background and have brought unique skill sets to already this early version of our idea. We have a proposed advisory board that we really do think will lead to important leadership insights that we're going to need to make sure that this is a successful venture. And ultimately, what we're really trying to do is help at that individual, family, system, and global level to really tackle some of the biggest problems that are facing all of cardiovascular medicine right now. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathryn. The floor is open for questions. Maybe we'll start with Darshan.
I don't actually have a question. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Excellent. And Julie?
Yeah, great presentation. I'm wondering, I saw that you, as one of your team members, have considered the idea of having an anti-smoker advocate. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you see them contributing to your project.
In two ways. One is certainly at the level of somebody who's hopefully been at the helm of how do you message this across what's been clearly a failed decades and multi-decades long timeline, right? We've all known that smoking needs to be taken off the table. It has huge impacts when it comes to healthcare, and yet we've not moved the needle a ton. We've moved it a bit. There certainly is a general reduction in smoking, but the concern over vaping and e-cigarette is now putting something else on the horizon. So we really need to revisit something that's been around for a long time. I think the second element about taking someone who's had that idea about how to message it is really the second element of that, where we talk about what's failed in the past. How do we understand people that have tried to quit, who have then gone through this journey, and ultimately, what is it that finally is the sticking point? Because I think that will be part of the app iterative design part that we need to really try to make sure that we understand. What is it that we can do differently when it comes to CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy elements that are being introduced here, to really try to say, how do we affect behavioral change and do something that's hopefully lasting?
Great, thank you. I love that.
I would just add on that note, like not only are we planning to go directly to smokers who have attempted to quit, but we're also hoping to also speak with specialists who work at these clinics to understand what had worked with these patients versus what has not, and try to develop our app and our algorithm just so that it can take into those elements that help the journey become successful for these patients who are looking to quit as well.
Great, thank you. Craig, please go ahead.
Great presentation, Kathryn. I love the idea. How do you distinguish between an increase in heart rate due to smoking versus something else? Like your slide's not working in your pitch presentation. I'm sure your heart rate raced a little. Would that trigger your app?
Yeah, we've talked about that as a group because that's a huge caveat, right? Several things, including good things like exercise, is going to lead to an increase in heart rate. And that will be part of why we think the AI chatbot that could be conversational will be a start point. It doesn't have to start with the negative, we caught you smoking. It can be, hey, I noticed your heart rate elevated. Are you stressed? Did you have a recent workout, or did you happen to have a cigarette? And it can be the beginning of a conversation, that they don't have to use something that's an input onto their device to actually be a self-start. It's already there as a trigger. What we have seen when we've gone through the literature is that there is, for the most part, a classic onset and then fall when it comes to the duration of what's to date been described for nicotine ingestion. So whether that will be true for all of the vaping products and the other compounds that might lead to an elevated heart rate within the vaping world, but certainly when it comes to tobacco use and cigarettes, we understand sort of, for the most part, there's at least some physiology out there around the onset and certainly the duration, which seems to be onset within the first minute and certainly duration being around 20 minutes. Tenzin, please correct me if I'm wrong. I think you did some of that research as well.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. We've seen that. So we've compared it against heart rate elevation during exercise, because obviously that's one of the key things that our fitness tracker currently picks up on. And we've seen that during exercise, when at the onset, there's a increase in heart rate. Of course, it is in accordance to the intensity of your exercise, but right when you stop exercising, your heart rate rapidly decreases. Whereas with smoking, we've seen that there is a pronounced increase right off the bat. And then once you stop smoking, your heart rate does not go back to baseline about 10 to 20 minutes post the smoking event. So we've seen distinction between the two. Obviously, there's more research that needs to be done, but of course, with our AI prompts, we are still planning on confirming with the user whether or not they've had a smoke.
Is there time for another story? Can I ask?
Sure. Yeah.
Just quickly, so the CBT model is a little different than I think like what traditional CBT might be, in that there's an immediate feedback, right? And it's prompted by the activity immediately. And I think it's maybe analogous to like your smartwatch buzzing if you've been inactive for a little period of time. Is there precedent that works, or is the effect wear off over time? People just silence the alert. Like, is there precedent that this model or this approach would be effective in the long term?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Sophie.
Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I was kind of responsible for looking into CBT and the use in apps already, and kind of user engagement strategies. And there is a significant amount of evidence for chatbot use in terms of user engagement. And that research was actually done in 2019. And one could argue that chatbots and like generative AI has just, totally changed how engaging chatbots can be since then. So it's definitely, there's a lot of evidence for engagement. And then with CBT especially, there is evidence and there's use cases that it is effective as well. Most prominent one is probably new, which has been used for weight loss. And it was shown to be effective in weight loss, and it mainly leverages CBT. And it did show a positive effect over time. So we'd hope to obviously demonstrate the effectiveness over time, but I think those two things are positive indicators for our app.
Okay, thank you.
And Sumaiyah, do you have any questions?
Yes. Hi. Thanks, Kathryn, for that great presentation. My question again comes to around what your potential intellectual property strategy is for your company and your product. If you have any thoughts around that.
We do. I'll wait and see if one of my team members want to take it. Yeah, so one of the things we thought about is there precedent out there that, because as you can maybe infer from, or because it's been stated explicitly, they already have a fitness tracker of some sort, which means they bought the device from X company. So the question is really, obviously that's not the IP. The IP can only be in the app and what we're actually claiming the app will do. So that is where it's really going to be on the machine learning, which I have spoken to IP experts, at least within UHN, about whether or not there is protocol, or at least some emerging precedent that you can get intellectual property on machine learning algorithms, and you can. So I think there's potential within that. It is certainly not at the level of the fitness tracker, not when it comes to heart rate. If at some point we have something that we want to embed differently because we've come up with some other diagnostic element, great. But that wasn't the part of today's pitch, and it's something we would keep in mind as we're trying to leverage, how else we really try to track the consequences of smoking. But there is certainly IP in the machine learning element of that app in the AI chatbot. How long and the durability, I think nobody probably knows, because what's going on with ChatGPT and all these chatbots that are language models, I don't actually think we know exactly what's on the horizon. It's shifting so fast.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kathryn, and the rest of the Panorama Health. We're going to move to our final team for today, and they are Pressure Pal. And from that team, we have Amanda Mack, Elizabeth Karvarsky, Daniel Dabutpur, and Meg Rathod. Please feel free to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much. Is everybody able to see my screen?
Yes, clearly.
Great. Okay. Okay, thanks so much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. We are Pressure Pal, a company developing remote monitoring devices to make care accessible for heart failure patients. We'd like to start off by introducing you to John. John is a 74-year-old man who presents to the emergency department with shortness of breath, cough, severe fatigue, swelling in his legs and feet, and on imaging, he is found to have fluid in and around his lungs. John has congestive heart failure. How does heart failure happen? Well, when you have high blood pressure or heart disease, your heart cannot pump blood to your body. As a result, it becomes weaker, and its ability to pump blood out worsens. This leads to a backlog of blood, which causes fluid to build up inside of your lungs, making it difficult to breathe. As well, there's fluid buildup in your extremities. 1 in every 3 Canadians is affected by heart failure. 50% of heart failure patients are rehospitalized within 6 months of their last visit. This is because managing heart failure requires long-term and constant support. Patients must see their healthcare team frequently to adjust their medications and ensure that symptoms do not arise. However, ensuring adequate follow-up and communication with your physician to prevent decline and rehospitalization is a huge challenge for many patients. This is especially difficult for patients like John, who live in rural communities. John lives in Red Lake, which is at least 6 hours away from Thunder Bay, where his cardiologist is located. He can't see his cardiologist often, and this makes it difficult for his care team to monitor and manage his symptoms, thus leading to his decline. This issue is not unique to John. He is part of the 43% of Canadians with heart failure who live in rural communities and do not have easy access to their care team. So how do we help patients like John? We are developing Pressure Pal, a wearable patch that allows for remote monitoring of jugular venous pressure. When the heart cannot pump blood out, the blood gets backed up into the internal jugular vein, leading to an elevated jugular venous pressure. Physicians routinely look for elevation of the jugular vein in heart failure patients to detect decline. However, current methods can only be done in person by a healthcare professional. Pressure Pal is a patch that patients wear on their neck over their internal jugular vein to continuously monitor its blood volume. It detects when a patient's heart is beginning to fail, allowing us to act before symptoms develop. Our patch uses reflected light and electrical conductance to specifically detect increased fluid backup into the jugular vein. And this elevation in fluid is sent to the Pressure Pal application on both the patient's and healthcare team's electronic devices. The care team receives an alert if jugular venous pressure has increased, which informs their decision to either admit the patient or remotely adjust their medications to reduce the fluid backlog. Pressure Pal is the first device that can measure fluid status remotely, and it's also non-invasive, user-friendly for patients, and inexpensive. PressurePal monitors jugular venous pressure, which is a well-established and standard metric for assessing heart failure patients. PressurePal also uses a robust multimodal method to directly measure jugular venous pressure. We are simply not looking for a visible elevation of the vein, which is only detected once it's too late, but rather we are monitoring for slight increases in volume in the jugular vein, allowing us to act before decline occurs. Our target market includes heart failure patients for whom travel is an issue, and this includes older adults and those who live in rural communities, such as John, and those with mobility issues. The demand for PressurePal in North America is substantial. In Canada and US alone, there are 7 million patients that suffer from heart failure, and of those 7 million, 4 million are either elderly, rural, or have mobility issues. We believe our device can easily benefit and get into the hands of 20% of this 4 million, which is approximately 800,000 patients with heart failure. Here's our timeline for the next 5 years. We will obtain initial and ongoing funding sources, starting with non-dilutive funding such as government grants and CIHR. And within the first year, we will develop a working prototype and partner with a principal investigator to design a clinical trial that will validate our product. By year 3, we will establish a partnership with UHN, file for patents in Canada and the US, and have concluded our clinical trial. We will then obtain regulatory approval for our device and register with the Ministry of Health Assistive Devices program. We plan to launch in year 5 and continue testing our device to validate and optimize its performance. And within the first year of our launch, we'll capture 5% of our obtainable market. We thank you for taking the time to learn about PressurePal and how we will make care more accessible for all heart failure patients, regardless of where they're located. And we're happy to take any questions. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Amanda, for that. Again, the floor is open for questions. We'll start with Julie.
Great presentation. So I'm wondering, when you talked about the actual technology, you said that it was user-friendly and easy to use. And I'm wondering, as a patient, I love when I hear these terms and I think about what does that actually mean in terms of user-friendliness, right? So I'm just wondering what factors you considered in making those claims.
Yes, thank you so much for that great question. And in terms of user-friendliness, so essentially PressurePal is really a patch. It's a wearable device and it's also wireless. And so really as a patient, if you're thinking in terms of like an end user like the patient, they simply have to obtain this patch, which we would want to allow them to do that through discussions with their healthcare provider. Wear that patch, and the patch will do all of the measurements in terms of detecting when there's an increased jugular venous pressure. It will automatically send an alert to the application. We haven't decided whether this would be sort of like a phone application or something on a computer, but we'd like to make that as accessible as possible for everybody to use, whether they have a phone or not. And that alert is also sent to their healthcare provider who also has that PressurePal application. And they'd be able to either admit that patient or contact the patient to remotely adjust their medications. But the idea is that the patient does not have to do anything actively on their own. They really just have to wear that patch and allow it to do its job and detect any changes in heart function.
And I just want to add to that as well, like this is meant for patients who really do have difficulties getting to the clinic. So one huge point of that, of making it easy to use, is you don't really have to leave your home. For rural patients, you don't really have to also consider leaving your support system back home to get to somewhere where you can actually get this measured. It's supposed to be somewhere that's at home, easy to use, convenient. So I just want to add that point as well.
Great, thank you very much. Darshan, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you very much for a really great presentation. I particularly liked you anchoring it with a patient's story. The question I have is, why have you chosen jugular venous pressure monitoring? The reason we use it clinically at the moment is because it's the best we've got. Like, we can't measure the pressures inside the heart. You showed a nice graphic explaining how heart failure develops. And that's what some of your competitors do. They give us pulmonary pressures, or they give us left atrial pressures, which are much earlier in the cascade of developing heart failure. Jugular venous pressure is quite late. So any thoughts, or can you explain why you chose that?
Yeah, for sure. So thank you for that great question. And you're definitely right. So this is sort of back into the competitive analysis that we did. So our competitors, there are devices out there that do measure, like, for example, pulmonary artery pressure, but those are invasive devices that must be implanted into the patient. And yes, they do provide a sensitive measurement in terms of, the heart function and how pressures are changing. But the idea with this technology is not simply just like currently, like the way to do it clinically is to measure like a visible elevation from the sternal angle. We are using the photoplethysmography combined with the bioimpedance technology to measure like changes in the fluid level or the blood, like the volume of that jugular vein. It does provide it is directly connected to the right atrium of the heart. And so we believe that that's a very close proxy in terms of when changes do occur, in terms of the heart failure pathophysiology, that would be reflected in the jugular vein. So it's not really just measuring that physical elevation of the distended vein, but looking at those very sensitive and slight changes in volume or fluid level. Another thing to point out too is that there is a competitor. There was another competitor that's non-invasive that's called JVP Labs, which looks at, like, they use a sort of like an ultrasound technology to look visibly at that elevation of the jugular vein. And so that's sort of how we definitely differ from them in terms of the technology, where it's not just a physical visual change in the height, but something much more sensitive than that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sumaiyah.
Hi, yes, great presentation. Thank you for that. My question goes back to, you mentioned a clinical trial. You plan to, I believe it was year 1 or year 2, to team up with a PI and then conduct a clinical trial. I guess I'm curious to know, how easy would it be to do a clinical trial for such a device? Is there something already in place where you know that this could be done very quickly, because you propose to do it within a year, I believe, if I understood correctly? You could just elaborate on that, please.
And thank you so much for that question. We would love to elaborate on our idea for that. So in the UHN, they have the largest population of heart failure patients, especially the ones that are undergoing transplant, for example. So through our connections with supervisors within that field, we believe that we would be able to have access to a large population of heart failure patients, and through submissions with REB and things like that, we would have access to that patient population. And more specifically, a lot of these patients undergo right heart catheterization, which is the gold standard for measuring pressure, such as the right atrial pressure. And as Amanda had mentioned, that is a proxy of what the jugular venous pressure of our device measures in an invasive way, versus our patch is non-invasive. So if we're able to correlate our non-invasive method with a gold standard invasive method, that will help give our device a more reliable and increase the specificity, as opposed to what is currently used in clinical settings, where physicians, for example, use things like a ruler to measure the jugular venous pressure. So doing a clinical trial like this, especially in a location like Toronto, where we have a lot of access to these patients, would really be accessible for our patch and increase our validity of what our patch would want to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Craig.
Great presentation, Amanda. I think, looking at your competitors, I think CardioMEMS is actually easy to use. I think the patient just lays on a pillow. Now it's expensive and there's other issues. And I think JVP is also easy to use because it's an imaging-based method. I'm wondering about the robustness of a patch as the form factor, where you really need good confirmation of the sensor to the skin to get bioimpedance for sure, and probably PPG. Is that the right approach? Like, knowing that, everybody will put the patch on a little differently. Some people will stretch it, some people won't.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And we did give sort of like the way that it would look a lot of thought. We decided on the patch because a patch is, it's something that's someone can really see. And I think a lot for patients, it's nice to be able to see what's measuring, whatever it is on your body, and it's something that's easy to put on, and they know that it's definitely a non-invasive method. And we would think that obviously in terms of like how we're going to be able to sort of sell this product and like distribute it, we would have to definitely collaborate with physicians or like cardiologists of these patients. And so perhaps the beginning, when a patient is first getting this pressure pal patch, that would be placed on by a physician or or a healthcare professional to ensure that it's placed on properly. There would have to also be some patient education, of course, around ways to maintain that patch and ensuring the correct placement. However, we do think that having this non-invasive approach and something that will allow for patients who live in remote areas to be able to have a constant measurement, that sort of overpasses, I guess, that slight consequence of having to readjust it a bit when it moves or things like that. So both the combination of initially placing that by the physician or healthcare professional, and also some patient education around how to maintain the patch.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda and the Pressure Pal team. So that concludes our pitch presentations for today. I want to thank the 4 teams for sharing their novel ideas. Just keep in mind, a lot of these trainees just a very little while ago, this is their first exposure to entrepreneurship. So I just want to congratulate all of them. So I'm going to pass the floor on to Anne Samart, who's going to be introducing the next portion of our event today. And meanwhile, I'm going to move the judging panel to a breakout room, and we'll be deliberating on who the winner is going to be. So Anne, the floor is yours. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Roar. So huge congrats to all of our teams. That was tremendous. And the judges will see you in 45 minutes as you go off and deliberate and debate. So I'm very pleased to be able to host our last fireside chat of the season. And Jacqueline, I see your name. I don't see your face. So maybe can you come off, can you come into the join with, start your video and unmute. So today we're really very lucky, I think, as a team and as a group of budding entrepreneurs to welcome Dr. Jackie Shreibati today to our last fireside chat. And I think many of you probably saw from some of the promotional material, Jacqueline is really coming from one of the global leaders in technology from Google Health. And she brings a very rich and deep kinds of experiences, not only to her thinking on some of the ideas that you've talked about, but really where we're going in the innovation and technology space with regards to health. At Google Health, she's the senior clinical lead, and where she actually leads a team of physicians looking at consumer health projects, including wearables and the Android developer platform, with an area of focus on heart health, on women's health, and sleep. So I know that you weren't able to hear all of the pitches, Jacqueline, but a lot of the folks in this room are very much in the space where you're really a global leader. So very, very excited to have you here. And I see we can see you now. So welcome.
Great. Thanks for having me, Anne. And really excited to be with this group.
That's great. Thank you. And I think, today you're now at Google Health, but previously you were chief medical officer at AliveCor, where really the notion of bringing the lab to the individual was really realized through the cardiomobile device, amongst others. So I think, that's also a space everybody's really excited about. And maybe the last thing I'll mention as part of your bio is that you're adjunct faculty at Stanford University School of Medicine, where you're also involved in their biodesign programs at Stanford and UCLA. And this crowd bridges the clinical with the engineering, with the science, the data science. So hopefully all in the space of the wonderful leadership that you offer globally.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think it's always interesting to go from learning about biodesign in theory to then in practice, then going from maybe a small team, like some of the teams here, identifying a need and building a concept around that need, to then the thrills of innovation within a large company, so becoming a so-called intrapreneur and dealing with some of the constraints around the innovation process there. So yeah, it's a wild ride.
And maybe we could start with your ride a little bit, and maybe just kind of a little bit about, given where you are today and the behemoth that is Google, and maybe just take a step back to earlier in the ride, and sort of like how you first became, an entrepreneur and your kind of origins in the business.
Yeah. And I'm not too far from the educational journey from, I think, many folks in the room. So I think the story can be quite relatable. I did all of my medical training and post school training at Stanford. And I came out, I'm still based in the Bay Area. I came out here very much thinking that I was going to become an academic physician. I wasn't necessarily set on cardiology, but I just thought that balance of doing research and seeing patients and teaching was just kind of satisfy all the different parts of my brain. I mean, like looking back, even in undergrad, I was an English literature major, and I just love this idea of kind of bouncing back between the different sides of my brain, and thought this is it. And I've seen plenty of examples of this. This makes a lot of sense. And it did for a while, but basically by the end of my cardiology fellowship, I started to imagine what my day-to-day would be like as an academic cardiologist, and specifically doing health services research. So I was using large insurance claims databases or clinical trial databases and linking them together, looking at the relationship between, say, introducing a new technology to a group of patients and the downstream cost and utilization that would follow therein. And that field, I think it's very empowering for young trainees, because if you know a little bit of programming skills, and I would say a little bit, like I was doing SAS and Stata nights and weekends, I could basically write the papers and do what I wanted. And I'm sure lots of folks in this room would like kind of, oh yeah, I've done that. I mean, like R is very empowering, just do it and publish. So there's very things that were very empowering for me as a young trainee, actually made my kind of near-term future feeling very isolated, because health services researchers can work in a corner and maybe have some stats help if they need it, but it can be very much a solo sport. And I was feeling a little bit claustrophobic with the path I had chosen. And I think, on top of me starting to question kind of my future in this field, I could not be influenced by the people around me. So I was training in the Bay Area. I had lots of colleagues going to get, a business degree on the side, or they were going into consulting or leaving medicine altogether. And I think I kind of had a breaking moment when I kind of looked over closest to me to my husband, who was working on a fintech startup at the time, and he was helping people save money by kind of gamifying their finances. And I started to kind of realize that he was probably influencing more people in a positive way around their health, their physical and emotional health, than I was writing papers about the health economics of left ventricular assist devices for about a dozen people in a corner over there. And so I just began to think about like the audiences that I was speaking to and the impact that I wanted to have. And it wasn't a regrets moment. I just think that I realized that like I had a skill set and I had desires that were a lot different than what I had maybe envisioned 10 years before. So I gave up some of my grants and started looking for work.
So that's a kind of interesting dynamic where you're like, am I going to do all this to write a paper that, I'm sure more than 5 people read your paper.
Well, like sometimes very few. Yes.
But then to think about like, how do I shape the way that people live their health, right? Yes. And was that sort of part of what kind of led you into AliveCor and your kind of early days, or like kind of what was your vision? Like, what were you aiming to do when you kind of became a cardiovascular?
Yeah, I think, there is a little bit less intentionality than one may like to see retroactively. I mean, I know that I wanted to use my current set of skills, and at that time it was clinical cardiology and large data sets, and I was a good writer. I'm coming back to kind of my skill sets in undergrad, and I knew that I wanted to apply that. But at the time when I was looking for work, I thought maybe I'll go work at an insurance company, right? Like we have something called Medicare Advantage, which is kind of the private industry takes over funding for government sponsored insurance and tries to make it more efficient and delightful. So there was a whole sprouting of these like MA plans. I thought maybe I can go do some analytics for that. That was like kind of like a literal interpretation of my skill set. I didn't kind of think, oh, well, I don't have a business degree. I don't have this experience. Like I'm not an engineer. I'm not an informaticist. Like I just didn't have any of those skills. So I basically was just putting myself out there and trying to find opportunities that.
So what was the magic? What was the magic? Something happened. Something broke through.
Yeah, I give this advice a lot. Like there was no job for me at AliveCor. I networked a ton. I was spending a lot of time meeting people, and I met the CEO at that time, and he said, well, I need some help interpreting this thing called hyperkalemia. I think we're going to make a deal with Mayo Clinic around potassium estimation from the EKG, and I just don't understand it. And I was very quickly able to communicate with him and be kind of a cross-functional collaborator and do it in I think a psychologically safe way. That's how we would describe it now. And it was, it was easy for me to communicate with the engineers. I don't think that's something I was training to do, but it just felt very natural. And so I had this, basically I was just kind of hanging out with the team for about 6 months before it became, I was getting paid. So it was a consulting like hourly gig, but it didn't become like a formal role until I had basically kind of shown my worth to a group that didn't think that I needed to be there. And I have to say that I don't think this is unique for clinicians. I think sometimes for just having deep subject matter experts at small companies, they really need to think twice about it, because we are expensive and we aren't essential to building the product, right? You could still build something. It could be unsafe and lack value, but you could still build a product, right? A health product without clinicians on board. So it was a slow burning process, but I just kind of developed a trusting relationship with those folks. And I think it's the same way when I advise startups now, or work across different teams at Google. It's that kind of same kind of slow relationship building with technical teams to kind of demonstrate value. And I enjoy it, but every single time you kind of have to reinitiate that relationship with a new team.
It's interesting because earlier you were talking about kind of the first phases of your career, kind of like that your research was a solo sport, and now you're very much in a team sport. Yes. What is also interesting is you're talking about it where sometimes the positions are defined and sometimes you define the position.
Yes. And
right?
I think it's getting comfortable, especially with the latter, like not knowing what the role is or why I'm there, or actually having people explicitly ask, why are you here? We don't need you. Being comfortable with the no's and trying to define your role and the value that you bring is, I think it's a source of frustration for lots of folks on my team who were coming from academia where their value was very self-evident. And now they're in a situation where they have to continuously demonstrate that. It's a challenge. I think it's also a good one. It's a good kind of, I think, solid skill set to have in any, business culture. You always should be demonstrating your value, right? Like you shouldn't just assume that people know why you're there.
Yeah. And I think like if you think about the environment of kind of the health environment today, digital health, I mean, you do need all these very rich perspectives on the team to kind of drive anything forward. Like, do you see the kind of constitution of the teams changing at all? Like certainly within Transform and within Echo Discovery, we got lots of people that are more clinical or more engineering, some that are more data science. Like, how do you see those roles on the team, those positions shifting as the world continues to evolve?
Yeah, I think it's very bespoke of the moment. It's usually reflecting your technical team's past experiences, probably with subject matter experts. Mm-hmm. So if, like looking to Google, like I've been there for almost 4 years and I've probably worked on a dozen projects. The ones where I've worked with product managers who are familiar with clinicians and the value they bring, you're immediately brought into those one-on-one meetings, and you're working with engineers on the design doc, and you're thinking about every step in the user journey, and you're reviewing every last word that's included in the mobile application, and it just makes it's efficient for those teams. On the other hand, if I'm brought into a new group who's never worked with clinicians or other presumably non-technical experts, they can see us as basically blocking value or taking bold approach to innovation, right? They could see us as like the lawyer in the room that's trying to stop a launch, right? So, and that's actually happened quite a bit. Like sometimes our value is saying, look, this is actually a huge reputational risk to the company, or it's going to cause some level of risk to our users, and so we don't think this thing should launch. So we do actually carry kind of that torch as well. So it's trying to find that balance between, helping to to expedite innovation and also do it in a safe way. And sometimes people just see us as the risk mitigators and they don't want us in the room. So doors close on us all the time. I can't tell you that. You just get very used to people saying like, you don't need to be here. And then you just try again. And usually you can find a way, but you get comfortable with the rejection.
Yeah, well, rejection within your own organization is always an interesting dynamic. When you're like, as you approach projects within the world of Google Health, like, do you have sort of like a certain kind of like approach of what you're coming forward with? Like, do you have your own kind of like, I don't know, entrepreneur like vision, or like has anything, like what do you bring into the room that is less about the clinical expertise, but more about how you want to shape the experience for the end user, patients, caregivers, consumers?
So I would say one example where it was like a clear win, and I'm still seeing kind of the ripple effect several years after introducing this topic, was trying to find ways to quantify the health literacy of our products. So Google's very interested in having automated metrics around, and it goes beyond just engagement or retention, like trying to find ways that users are actually getting value from, it could be an app, it could be some experience on search, it could be something on YouTube. So how do you quantify the user's understanding of their own health and feeling like they have more confidence in managing their health? And so I would say 2 years ago, we were trying to find ways to quantify that and make that scalable so that the usability researchers, that the PMs, our product managers could kind of take that as a success metric, because they need to demonstrate like why this product is helpful. And so that's been interesting because, you can introduce a concept and you can say, oh, look, like, our federal agencies, including the CDC, they have all these ways of measuring health literacy from an academic perspective. You have checklists. You can do patient talkback, right? Like if you introduce a concept, you can test the patient again by asking them, like, how do you understand it? Repeat it after me. How do you bring that into things like informed consent or onboarding with a mobile app, or the way, like, how much graphics to text should you have on a particular page? So it was basically like giving these teams at Google kind of the credence of this whole academic field of health literacy, and using that as a stepping point for them to innovate in ways that they could measure the success of design or onboarding, or some of the more kind of dry things about mobile app development, like informed consent. So that was a very powerful way. That wasn't necessarily like a medical one, right? I wasn't talking about, atrial fibrillation in that case, but I was kind of bringing some of that more public health dimension, or rigorous ways that we measure patient engagement, and giving that as fodder for digital health development. So that's kind of taken a life of its own, where our user researchers can kind of do what they need to given the project that they're working on.
And like, to me, that also speaks to sort of all the notions about the digital divide. And certainly like health literacy is one of the components that often gets talked about in terms of sort of like all the things that we have to overcome as we think about digital innovation in such a way that it's accessible and usable, transferable, applicable in all of our diverse populations. I mean, I'm in the most diverse city in the world, in Toronto, but I mean, it's a huge global community, and these wearables or any of these products are being designed for the global community. Do you, in the work that you do, are there other things that you really do to kind of bring that significant kind of focus on diversity and equity? How do you imagine as whether it's Google Health or others, could really kind of seek to bridge that digital divide?
Yeah, I think, smaller companies have some advantage if they have, deep connections with a community and they're on the ground, like you're building for your town or you're building for your community, right? Like you're going to get that direct feedback that you can, and it's really important sometimes to get that in person, right? And you can really build deep, rich experiences. And that's what I think a lot of quality improvement projects at our local hospitals or in our clinics do, right? They do a really great job. They identify an issue and they can address that particularly and go really deep because they see those patients in, day in and day out. And I'm a practicing cardiologist and I work in a safety net, like a community hospital. So I see kind of that like deep, rich experience for like a particular group in a particular zip code or geographic area, and that's very effective. It's a very kind of different experience when you're told to, improve the lives of billions of people, right? Like that by any notion of biodesign is almost like you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because everyone is no one, right? Like how many different verticals of people are you going to build for? And I think that's the tension that you have at like these like larger tech companies, because they don't think about 100 people or 10,000 people. They're thinking about billions of people. And that can be very difficult to build, high quality, valuable health experiences for. So you kind of have to distill the best principles, right? You want to build for, experiences that are easy to understand, that are, going back to these kind of health literacy principles that have a good use of graphics, because sometimes you can convey things better in graphics than text. On the other hand, I'll give you an example. Sometimes graphics are actually not good. Like, yeah, I work on Fitbit mobile app because Fitbit was acquired by Google a couple of years ago. So the Fitbit kind of software is now the engine for the Pixel Watch, which is Google's recent development in the kind of the smart watch space. So all the fitness stuff is basically the Fitbit, steps and sleep and readiness and mindfulness. That's all kind of packed into this Google hardware. I think engineers love graphics and they like showing, like your HRV going up and down and your sleep and then all the stages of your REM and your non-REM. And like, I don't even understand the sleep stages. Like I memorized that for med school and now I look at that graph and it just makes me nauseous. So there gets to a point where like the graphics aren't necessarily the best way to summarize your experiences. So we've actually had to push back on some of the kind of tendency to build these complex graphical displays of data and say, actually, you just need to summarize in plain English what happened in the last, 7 days or 30 days, because that's actually how you communicate to the most number of people, whether they are, fitness fanatics or folks who just got this wearable for the new year and they have a New Year's resolution. So sometimes that kind of most common denominator is the way that we're, I think, making the most impact to the most people, but there's a risk of things being too diluted. And I think that's just, again, when your scale is hundreds of millions or billions of people, like something will be lost. You do need to rely on either the developer ecosystem or building partnerships with teams that can build kind of deep experiences for particular types of patients or communities. But yeah, I think you have to rely on the ecosystem, which is something that Apple does very well. I think our Android health and fitness developer ecosystem is it's becoming more developed. We do have now additional experiences to help bring in health and fitness developers on the Play Store, but you do need to lean into kind of smaller groups who are doing some of that hard work.
No, I think, and sometimes you have to decide how high tech are you going to go, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I loved the piece that you wrote for the New England Journal called "When Low Tech Wins," where you were kind of talking about, reverting to kind of more basic conversations. And in some way, part of what you're saying is sometimes we need to revert to the essentials as opposed to the kind of cacophony of data that we can pull out of these things, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, whether it's a conversation on a phone or, trying to pull back from these like crazy 3D graphics with like all these different axes and just give people the summary in plain English or the language of their choice, right? I think that's one of the appeals of these large language models is that it's speaking people's language. It doesn't have to be that complicated to get, messages across. So yeah, the tech will not solve all of our problems here.
No, it's definitely true. I think that there's a few questions from the floor, but before I open up to the floor, I think I can't not ask you about, artificial intelligence and digital innovation. I think everybody knows this has been a very interesting week with kind of tech leaders from around the world sort of talking about AI as an existential threat to humanity, sort of like very daunting kind of fears, but also massive inspiration and opportunity. So just maybe could I just ask you to reflect a little bit on your thoughts about how IA will change the landscape of healthcare and healthcare innovation?
Yeah, there is a podcast that I've been listening to recently to help kind of organize the thoughts around this, because I agree there's lots of noise. It's hard to kind of make sense of it all. It's a New York Times podcast called Hard Fork, which I do recommend. It's like easily digestible, keeps people on top of things. And they were talking about the different types of AI risk that we all get worried about. And one of them is like the risk that we have because AI is working extremely well, right? It becomes, superhuman. It will endure and stay alive at all cost, and we cannot stop that machine. And I think that's where kind of this terror, the existential concerns come from. There's also kind of the more near-term risks around when AI doesn't work, right? When it hallucinates or makes up peer-reviewed studies or tells you the opposite thing, or reflects social bias because it knows that you have a particular perspective and it wants to make you happy. It wants you to click the like button on the response. I think in the near term, what I'm seeing at Google and definitely in the ecosystem around healthcare, it's definitely that like latter risk that seems to be preoccupying most of the work. Like I spent a lot of my time thinking about the ways that we can make these models do less harm, because we know that they aren't performing like doctors. And, for example, answering questions from licensing exams is not the same skill set as summarizing your charts or answering tough questions for which there is no, golden truth or standard truth. For example, like in nutrition, that's something that you don't get tested on, at least in U.S. medical training. We don't get a lot of answers or questions around that on our licensing boards. And certainly, if you go into any of these chatbots and ask about saturated fat, is it good or bad for you? Well, the internet says everything and nothing at once around this topic. It's not something that our guidelines have stayed up to date on. And so it's going to be very hard to get good answers when the medical literature is either in evolution or we don't have consensus. So I'm kind of overwhelmed by those experiences right now. I do think this is it's a life-changing technology. It's making strides in replacing people and their work and making others more efficient. And those are things to keep abreast of and be thoughtful citizens and pay attention to. But I think in the near term, especially in these fields like legal and finance, education, healthcare, we're just working as hard as we can to make these not just useful, but avoiding harm.
And always back to that notion of the risk to the patient at the end of the day, and that kind of the fundamentals, just like what you do on those teams, I guess, and bringing in that perspective when they keep wanting to boot you out of the room.
I don't think people expect that like living, breathing products out there are going to deliver false information, right? Like you put something in and you ask a question and there's that kind of automation bias. You just expect that, of course, it's going to tell you the right answer. But if you don't actually fact check, you'd be surprised how much stuff is coming out of these models that is either inaccurate, made up, or not answering the question that you actually gave, right? It's answering a different question. Yeah. So we'll have to become more savvy, and hopefully the models will get better, as we also become savvier consumers of it.
Yeah, I think what we put into the system will teach us a lot, but I think Yeah, I don't know, I'm just watching it unfold. I mean, on, pandemics, when it's a threat on the scale of pandemics and nuclear war. And then, people are chat GBTing all day long. It's, it will definitely shape our lives for not just our technology. I'm going to turn it over to a couple questions that we have in the chat. So there's a question in here from Sophie. How do you decide between helping a lot of people by a small amount, so providing millions of people, healthy people with detailed HRV, versus a venture where you help a small number by a greater amount? Like, how do you, I think she means versus a lot of people by a smaller amount.
Yeah, no,
That notion of like how big, where to go.
I think I've seen lots of different viewpoints of this from within Google. And, when it comes down to it, you have to decide, or you have to know, like, what is your incentive for building a product? So you can build, at a large company where you have some room to grow, features that are socially beneficial, but maybe they don't carry a revenue stream behind it, then you actually have the luxury to ask these questions. At other places like this, you don't even have that luxury, right? Like, you need to have a very clear understanding of who your customer is and the business model around that. And I wouldn't say, detailed HRV for healthy people is like a healthy business model for a startup, right? Like, those are kind of like innovating on the margins, where that's great, right? Maybe it'll help people like your product a little more, but I don't know if that's going to keep people paying your subscription model for premium any longer, or switch to a different wearable. So I think it's kind of depends on the maturity, maturity of the business. But I have seen this philosophical question about, like, well, maybe we should be building more impactful products for fewer versus making small improvements on the margin for millions. And it just depends on what your incentives are. So, Fitbit and the Pixel hardware team, where my team sits, we need to sell more phones. We need to sell more watches, right? This is the business. So how do you do that? And then also, deliver value and make it helpful for as many people as you can. So there's certain kind of constraints around, like, how you operate before you can, make those questions.
But even within cardiovascular health, I mean, there's some projects that affect a large number of the population, and then some that would be more niche. So I think it's a very real dynamic, even within our maybe more niche space.
I think it would depend also on your exit strategy, right? If you have an institutional investor that sees that your TAM as a reasonable one because it's part of a large portfolio of projects, then you could, and that you kind of see that that's how your product will evolve and eventually exit, then it makes a lot of sense to focus on a small group. If it kind of just depends on how you see your business evolving and what the portfolio that you see, what is your first chapter and your second chapter. If you're starting with a software product that's going to help a lot of people, but you see this is just kind of the evolution of where we're going, then we're going to really, specialize once we get a certain amount of profitability, right? It's kind of the narrative of your business. And when the exciting part is you can continue to evolve that based on how much runway you have.
Yes, and how attractive and amazing your product is. There's a question in here about, I'm not 100% Vaswani's question. I'm going to try. He says, how is the experience with market registration? What's been your experience with market registration? So getting through kind of the various FDIA, for example, hurdles in Canada, it's Health Canada, as you think about creating a device or creating an app or creating a digital product. Do you have some advice, especially for folks in this group who are very early in their stages?
So if you have access to some, consulting or advisory support around, I think they would officially be called a global regulatory assessment. But if there's someone that could provide some high level feedback as to first of all, is your product or feature a medical device, depending on the country you're in? And if so, what is the class? What is the level of risk? And then helping you kind of chart out the things you might need to do in order to get clearance. I mean, then you kind of have, it's not a cookbook, but you kind of have the steps in front of you to help kind of clarify your plan. So having those experts, it's almost required, right? I think startups, you might just be able to, have hourly consultation from someone. Larger companies will have it in-house, or they work with large firms that kind of carry the strategy forward. If you're in the software space, I think there's a lot more innovation and kind of ambiguity around regulatory strategy. You can have a little bit more liberty to kind of interpret the regulation as you see fit, depending on what your claims are or how your software is working. And that tends to be a moving target depending on the region you're at. So again, like having some expertise in the room that can not only like plot out like what's going to happen in the country of interest for the next couple of years, but also someone that can work with you if you're trying to push the boundaries of what you think is possible. We spent a lot of time here thinking about all the different kind of grades of not quite a medical device, right? Like the FDA, there's a certain type of experience that is considered a device, but it's low risk enough for the public that they just said, we're going to have enforcement discretion, and you need to have your books in order in case you ever got audited, but we're not going to require this to be a regulated experience. And then there are other things that are more lightweight. There are other things that you might think require, really intense clinical upfront validation, and there could be other options given kind of the access to data sets now. So definitely early expertise is important, but you don't want to, I think, over-index on kind of past experience, especially in the software space, because there's just a lot of room to kind of take a different pathway or have kind of a staged approach to getting clearance. So.
Yeah, and also maybe earlier stages, you don't need to go for the most complex regulatory framework on the planet, because I think that can also be daunting for an early team as they kind of ideate their way through. There's a question here from Nathan. How can we mitigate biases in data sets that already exist or that are being used in current machine learning models? Do you believe that new data sets will need to be collected?
Well, I think the first step, and one that a lot of the regulators are now expecting, is just starting with transparency first. I wouldn't say it is the kind of the norm that when people publish a proprietary algorithm, exactly the set that the algorithm has been tested and trained on, and then if there's been any external validation, like what kind of individuals was that validated on. So there's definitely a push in the US particularly, and also in the EU, around kind of transparency expectations. Once we have those, then you can begin to see kind of where gaps are, right? Because we'll start to say, oh, we only had 10 data points for this intersectionality in this patient population, right? Like at least we're getting that out there to users, and often clinicians kind of decide if they're going to use the product or not. Because for the longest time, most of the algorithms that we're using, whether it's a Framingham or Chats2Vasc or Hasbled or any of these calculations, like those algorithms, sure, they were based on logistic regression, but they also were missing lots of data points and not fully representative of patient populations. So first of all, it's just bringing that to our attention. I do think that there is some work in simulating different data sets and trying to extrapolate populations if it's not in the current data, and using that as a way to kind of check, benchmark the work. That does take a lot of effort, but I think that's one of the use cases for large language models, is actually developing these synthetic data sets in a more kind of cost effective manner, so that you can start to test on different populations. And we have to do a better job of collecting the data. And that's hard because we're often incentivized only to continue doing what we did yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So at least in the US, there's definitely new interoperability requirements that include things like not just collecting sex assigned at birth, but including gender, including different aspects of race and ethnicity and other social determinants of health, and actually kind of standardizing that. Because if we don't demand that we collect this information routinely, however flawed it is, then we can't start to be better long term. So it's going to be a Herculean effort.
Yeah, and just don't feel bad because it's not, we're in the same kind of issues in Canada, just about trying to really change the way that we collect information for healthcare, period.
Yeah.
And it's a massive kind of journey to go forward. I wonder, because a lot of the folks that are in the room are in academia, or whether they're, pursuing advanced degrees or they're in an academic, like health sciences center. I wonder, what do you see as how academia and industry might kind of come more together in the innovation space? Do you have some reflections that you could share?
I think in some institutions it's thriving, and it will depend, I think, on the relationships of the senior leadership in a division, or it could be writ large at the university and industry. So we have many decades of close collaboration between industry and Stanford, right? And that goes back to like semiconductors and building computers, like building the internet, like some of this stuff kind of goes back way. And so that kind of stigma around it is less, but it's certainly not absent. And I think that a lot of my peers who are at Stanford, they still struggle to do innovation in a way that is rewarded in a traditional kind of academic cycle, because still the currency of progression is funding and output through peer-reviewed manuscripts. So finding different ways where leadership can acknowledge kind of less traditional ways of professional development, I think is still a struggle, despite having, 50, 75 years of that cultural comfort, right, between those relations, like industry relationships are there. So it's still, I think, a ways to go. Some institutions just see conflict of interest all over it, and they're worried that that's going to harm patients and cause biased care. And I think we have to keep those concerns at the top of our minds, right? We have to be aware of the dangers of too much cross collaboration. I think cardiology is always tossed that aside, to be frank. I mean, like, we have a lot of deep relationships with medical devices and medication, and a lot of the evidence generation for our technologies are done within academia. So people might see me and say, oh, I'm conflicted, but then I say, well, what about the electrophysiologist at Stanford who's getting paid by like 12 device companies around pacemakers and implantable loop recorders? And like, we all carry kind of different conflicts. And I think the key is, again, the transparency, making sure our patients are aware of it, and checking ourselves and making sure we're behaving kind of in ways that we can at least address bias. Like, it won't ever get rid of the bias completely, right? But at least we can try to mitigate it.
Yeah, no, and I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge as we all wear many hats and we bring many lenses to the work that we do and the collaboration between academia and industry. So maybe I have time for one last question. So I think, one of the challenges, a lot of in the presentations earlier, people had a number of different ideas that they were pitching: devices, apps, programs. Some more conceptual didn't necessarily have a platform. But I wonder if you could just speak to kind of how you see the role, especially because in the app space, Google and Apple really dominate. They own the space. I think there was a recent estimate that they own 92% of the market. So how do you imagine that leaves room for kind of startups to fit in? And then also, they're also the gatekeepers to accessing apps, because, you have to put it on the Apple Store, right? So how do you kind of see, as we go forward, that health apps and the role of Google and Apple might shift to make it still equitable, but maybe have some standards about health apps, maybe different or companion standards to what, the FDA or Health Canada might have? How do you see that dynamic playing out? Because the goal really is to make things accessible to the most people to benefit the most.
I mean, I think, and there's some tension in your question, because on the one hand, we want we want developers to get their apps into the hands as many people as possible and not have big tech as a blocker. On the other hand, there's this expectation that these companies are doing all that they can to protect users' privacy and ensure trust. So I think that is a balance. I mean, both Apple and Google have pretty rigorous developer policies around user data in the health and fitness space because it is so highly sensitive. So like, you know, on the Android side of things, I've spent quite a bit of time working with developers on informing their users about access to camera or Bluetooth or audio. There's a lot of like pretty rigorous standards around that. It can also be the source of concerns that they can't get their app onto the store because of compliance, right, around these kind of developers' requirements around privacy. I think on the whole, health, like financial data, is bucketed in kind of the most sensitive data. So any leak is extremely harmful to not only the user but to the brand and to like the reputation of the company. So they tend to be pretty conservative in terms of making sure that these apps and their ability to kind of remind users, like, are you sure you want this app to access your phone? Are you sure you want this app to access your camera? Like, those are all very intentional, because any unintentional access to camera, right, you could be giving all of this, you know, you take a screenshot of your passwords, you take a screenshot of your credit card information, like now that information is basically available to any developer. So this is kind of this balance of supporting the ecosystem and trying to avoid, you know, potential leak of your most private information or the information of your loved ones, because you often have information from your family or friends on your phone as well. It's not an easy balance to achieve. With regards to like the health and fitness ecosystem, you know, Google has Google Fit, and you have, you know, the health app on the Apple side of things, but kind of going back to these being multi-purpose, kind of all-purpose apps for the everyday user, like that only gets you so far in terms of differentiated experience. And these companies are not going to build a million differentiated experiences for users. So the heart failure app will be built by a startup or will be built by a smaller developer. Again, because we will not, that doesn't achieve our mission of helping billions of people be healthier. So I think that there can be a helpful and efficient trade-off of these, like, again, these deep, rich experiences through the developer ecosystem and kind of this like generic, multi-purpose, all-inclusive health and fitness experience. These can be like default apps, right, in your phone, but they're not going to be answering the questions that transform heart failure care is addressing.
Yeah, they should, though. They really, really should. All right, so it's we got 4 more minutes left. I know that we have a winner and the judges are back in the room. So a huge thank you, Jacqueline, for joining us today and for sharing not only your own journey, how you made room for yourself at the table, how you went from solo sport to team sport of digital innovation. And we look forward, no doubt, to seeing what next will come. And thank you so much.
Thank you for the warm invitation. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So Craig, I'll turn it over to you to, I believe you're going to announce the winner on behalf of the judges panel.
I am. Thank you, Anne. I just want to echo my thanks to Jacqueline for her outstanding keynote. And I will introduce the winner shortly. I do also want to thank and congratulate Soror, Anne, Augusta, and Elizabeth for really great success for this inaugural Echo Discovery session. The judging panel was all really impressed by the quality of all 4 pitch presentations. I think that really is a testament to the quality of the training they received in the Echo Discovery program and from the Transform HF, TBEP, and Ideation Clinic teams. So thanks to all of you. And then congratulations to our 4 teams. It was outstanding. All of your pitches were excellent, particularly considering you just started on this journey just a few months ago. So really great job. And you made the judges' decisions very difficult. Each of us went into the breakout room with a different ranking of the 4 ventures, and we had to debate back and forth for a long while to come up to some agreement. But in the end, we did come up with a consensus, and there was one venture that we felt really stood out for their innovative idea that was very well researched, for clearly identifying a pressing need with a massive market, and for the effectiveness of their team that came across in their presentation. And that team and the winner of our inaugural $500 Echo Discovery Prize is Panorama Health. So congratulations to Panorama Health and its group members, Tenzin Yangzom, Nathan Holwell, Ruilin Wu, Kathryn Howe, and Sophie Sigfstead. Congratulations. To all our teams, congratulations to you as well. Please consider applying to ECHO. ECHO is our year-long entrepreneurship training program in cardiovascular health innovations, and that will really help take what you've started today and started through the discovery program and really help you launch your innovations to the further down that translational pathway. And if anyone else is in the audience is interested in ideation, entrepreneurship, and translation and doesn't really know where to start, look for the next call for Echo Discovery, and you could be the next one up here winning $500. So congratulations again to Panorama and to all our ventures, and to Anne, Soror, Augusta, and Elizabeth. Thank you again. Great event and great job. I'll maybe pass it back to Anne or to Soror just for final comments. Yeah.
Sure. Just maybe thanks, Craig, and thank you to our 4 judges. Congrats to all 4 teams and to the Panorama team. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, as you well know, this was our first year launching Echo Discovery. And so you, in many ways, have been learning, we've been learning, I guess, along with you. So we're going to send out kind of a wrap-up evaluation of the whole program. And so I would really ask for you to give us your advice, your thoughts, what you think works, what you think didn't, what you think is missing, how even format. We're really, on behalf of the team, like Soror and I and Augusta, we're very much kind of grappling with, where do we go next for the edition for 2024? So I just want to I know sometimes it's a pain to fill out evaluation forms, but we're really kind of going to consolidate everything that we've seen so far, but would really ask that you bring your best. I think Kathryn made a comment that we needed to have people who were able of critical thinking. I would like it if you could bring your constructive criticism forward and your critical thinking to really help us learn from this first year and continue to make it great. So that would be just my last call. I don't know, Soror, if there's anything else, but other than that, I think we're good to close out today's session.
No, thank you, everybody. And I have nothing else to add. Just if you have colleagues who are interested in the Echo Discovery, just know that the call for application will be in the fall. So keep checking out the website that I put it on the webpage, and please share. And as Anna said, please, the survey, your input will be really, really helpful for us as we improve and evolve the program. So thank you all.
Sure. Can I just add, I want to thank the judges again.
Yes.
Gave their time. Yeah, Sumaiyah Rehman, Julie,
and Darshan.
Oh, there's Julie Vizza, yeah, and Darshan. I think he's not here anymore, but thank you very much to the judges for their time as well.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.